audit exemption, because we feel that even for the small companies, there's still a role for auditors to play. I'm curious, Tan Sri, because when this question about, what drives you or what has encouraged people to act in a trusted way, it's interesting to me that sometimes personal experiences with a mentor or an individual sometimes comes up. So Sir David last week made the point that he was very inspired by David Flint, the current HSBC's chairman's father, who was his mentor. I just wonder, Tan Sri, in your career, was there anyone that in your mind stood out as being someone that you looked up to from a trust point of view?
I was trying to reflect on whether there was a teacher that taught both of us and that had that role. But I think of that. It's interesting that you mentioned David and David Flint, because I had dinner with his son, Douglas Flint, who, as you know, is the, as you said, is retiring chairman of HSBC. Just last weekend, I think it was the last weekend, he was in town, and I was having dinner with him, and he was talking about how David Tweedy had worked with his father before. Interesting anecdote. Well, I think we are influenced by many, and I would be hard pressed to single out one individual. I think I think in many ways our views and are formed by the actions of those that we come to associate with, both in terms of our parents. Many people don't know, but my father was one of the first Sikh accountants in the country. So that was. So I was thinking, I was quite encouraged by the fact that I followed his footsteps, and he certainly represented a great deal in terms of views on integrity as an individual, trust and confidence. People that we had in terms of professors at university and people that I've worked with and colleagues actually, and I'm very fortunate to be able to be working in an institution for which there are many individuals who serve the public interest and who focus on the public good and ultimately play a great deal in inspiring some of the that trust and confidence that I talked about, and one that has a big influence on you.
Thank you. Well, another question that's come up in Pigeonhole, 11 votes, this one, says, how does SC strike the balance between overregulation and self-regulation? That's a tricky one.
Yeah, it is a tricky one. How do we strike the balance between overregulation and self-regulation? Well, let's, as I said, regulation is really a bit of an art in many ways. There is no exact science to this. And, when you serve the public interest, there are many different dimensions of what, you have to take into account. If this pendulum goes too far on investor protection, we are mindful that it may stifle business activity. And if you're far too pro-business, there's a risk that investor protection may, at some instances, get compromised. So you've got to strike the balance correct. And in doing that, one of the ways that we try to reflect that is we take an extremely strong view in terms of public consultation. Some of this could be done through a public consultation process. Some of this could be done through a much more smaller subset of policy discussions that we take place. Take, for example, the view on technology. Our position on those frameworks that you mentioned before was a very tricky one because we were introducing new dimensions to allow equity crowdfunding, P2P financing, and what have you. And we were conscious that this was new frontiers, but at the same time, overregulation would have stifled the growth of this segment completely. And so therefore, you had to be able to get the balance correct. And that's exactly what we did. And we do that for different segments as well. And so, the calibration of that, as I said, is never easy, but you are balancing those interests. Now, where those interests ultimately requires a real trade-off, we will ultimately on the side of investor protection if it requires a real trade-off. But very often, as I said, SC has been very facilitative of growth. You've seen the figures that I've cited. That sort of amount of capital raising won't occur unless we are confident that the markets can exercise a certain amount of discipline on its own. Then the other comment, the other question was around self-regulation. Now, self-regulation, some people think is an oxymoron, right? I don't subscribe to that particular view. I think there is, in my view, there is a major role for self-regulation. I think, we believe that there is a lot of effort that can be played with the right incentive structures around self-regulation. We believe in it greatly. We have created the SRO in our FIM, which is the industry for SRO for the unit trust industry. We believe that there is a role for self-regulation. We also believe there is a role for market regulation, or market discipline as we call it, which is the role that institutional investors, very large institutional investors play in demanding better governance, etc. And of course, there is a role for the regulatory side as well. So I think it is not really a case of overregulation, self-regulation. I think it's self-regulation has a role to play in the overall architecture of regulation that we have.
Well, certainly that balancing act is quite important, as you were saying. But I think the SC should be commended for being brave enough to bring some of those digital funding initiatives in, because I know many countries have been talking about it and playing in sandboxes. But we've actually gone out and done it.
Yeah.
In fact, one of my friends has just raised, I think, almost 2 million for her little project.
Yeah, but it just demonstrates, ultimately it goes back down to trust as well, if you think about it, right? I mean, people are actually investing. I mean, if you think about equity crowdfunding, I think we have had quite a significant proportion of funding that's occurred through this space between equity crowdfunding and P2P. I think the numbers currently are close to 30 million, I think. Isn't that right, Eugene? I think it looks around that number. And of which we have had quite a large number of businesses that have been able to raise funding through the equity crowdfunding mechanism. Remember, this is not billion-dollar companies. These are small businesses. And some of them have been able to raise to the order of about more than 1-2 million in 24 hours. And interestingly, from a demography that is below 35 years of age. I think 30-40% of the participants in this segment are below 35, which goes to show that people of that age are trusting their consumers who trust that. Sometimes the people who invest here are people who have experienced directly as customers. And therefore, that is all about trust being reflected in the business environment. So we are enabling that. We take a view that we have a role in terms of promoting the very large investments, the billion-dollar infrastructure investments, but also at the same time to address capital raising at that segment of the continuum.
Well, it's certainly a very laudable objective, because as compared to many of our regional neighbors, our percentage of SMEs as part of the GDP is still relatively low. It's about 40%. So things like that would certainly help. Tan Sri, we have another question with 6 votes. Tan Sri, as chairman of SC Malaysia, how do you build trust among your team? Can you share an example?
Well, I think we have a very open discussion in the organization. I believe that in an organization that is does not stifle open discussions, and therefore one of the key things that we have is very robust discussions. In fact, some of the discussions that we have internally on some of the issues that we work on, there can be very strong views, which is very good. And I think that provides an element of trust in a sense that it encourages people to be open. Transparency is a very important dimension of what we do internally. We encourage people to be able to express their views. We empower people to be able to make decisions. So we trust them in their ability to make the right decisions. And and the fortunate thing that we have is we are very competent individuals, And so there's a structure around the SC which ultimately focuses on, as I said, openness, empowerment, and an element of ensuring that we work in a collaborative manner. And that ultimately, I think, translates to trust among the team.
So it certainly helps with the buy-in with your staff. So we have another question, and this is interesting, 11 votes. So the question goes, as the burden for a company to succeed may place undue pressure on accountants, tone at the top is the key factor to uphold the ethics value. Has ethics been included as an agenda in your plan? So I guess what it's kind of implying is that since the boards are not made up all of accountants, we have to deal with some non-accountants there, what else could be done to perhaps put that on the board agenda?
Well, you know, I think there are many dimensions to this, right? I mean, so we've done work in our whole corporate governance framework has focused on many aspects of what a company's board should take on in terms of responsibility. And then, as you know, in the area of financial services, many aspects have not just been governance failures, but also failures of ethics and professionalism. And this is where the central bank and the SC had worked on setting up the Financial Services Professional Board, which of course David Tweedy is a member of. And the whole idea of that is to be able to reflect a lot more in terms of ensuring that we reflect ethics as well. And I think, this is something that, ultimately does come back down to what, it's many of the transgressions that we've seen around the world, unfortunately, have been a breakdown of ethics. And that is something that, needs to be addressed through these sort of mechanisms. So the SC certainly has been encouraging that. And, but in many ways, some of these are not things that are legislative in nature. And they're very nebulous concepts. And that's why work of groups like the Financial Services Professional Board becomes very, very important to reflect some of that.
Well, I remember asking...
Are you involved in that fight as well?
Not really.
No, you're not there. Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah. But I do remember asking a particular chairman of a board why, because this particular board, the chairman would set a test for any potential director. And I said, why would you want to do that? And he said, because it was to make sure that those coming onto the boards actually understood a little bit about the corporate context and ethics. And he wanted to test them. So even though there was a nomination committee, he still had to give them a 10-question test. So anyway, just thinking about something else you said in your speech, sir, and we talked about technology and this teaming collaborative. But in transparency, unfortunately, accounting standards somehow or another seems to get, brought into that little area. I remember, in fact, asking Sir David last week, how come there wasn't a standard for valuing trust? To which his answer was, we're not clever enough. So I suspect there may be a Nobel Prize out there for an accountant who can figure out how to value trust. But in your view as a regulator, looking at where we are with accounting standards and so on, is it going the direction that you had hoped? Or do you feel that there are things that maybe in the international arena we should be doing more of?
I think accounting standards, if you ask me, have become far too complex than is necessary. So a lot of nodding heads around. I think everybody here sort of agrees as well. And I think, it's
just as well I don't have anything to throw at.
I just, I sometimes wonder, why that's the case. But, if you look at it, at the beginning, they used to be, many, many years ago, you had all these analysts, etc., who were saying that, you needed more information, you needed more complex valuations, etc., etc. And now they're saying, oh, God, this is so complicated, all we need is just give us cash flow, so that, we'll work it out. And I think it's come a full circle. And I think sometimes the complexity, if you have, it's been a long time since I've sat in an accounting standards board meeting, but I think sometimes the complexity seems to be complexity for the sake of complexity, right? It's basically that. And my colleagues will realize this, and I keep telling them, it's, really sort of, just give it to me in simple language. actually. And I think this is critical because ultimately, if you think about it, I mean, and this is where, for example, we're debating this whole issue of, disclosures as well. You can have a massive prospectus, but is an investor really going to read that? They don't actually. And the point that I was making is sometimes these disclosures are done purely to protect the legal liability. But information should be provided that is valuable to the user, and it must be provided in a form that is also valuable to the user. I don't think we're getting that. So if you ask me, and I know both David Tweedy well and Hans Hugo was the current chair of the ISB, and the point that I make, your question is global in nature. To them is, guys, come on, you've just got to get into something more practical. I mean, in terms of what's being done. This whole financial instrument standard, my God, I know the Edge has carried a piece there. Richard members of the Edge media, please don't quote me on this today, guys. But it's a highly complex instrument that has taken years and years to prepare. And so I think, you touched a raw nerve here when you asked me this question. My sense really is that we should move towards more simplified disclosure, etc. And certainly at the SC, my colleagues know this, we are moving towards that approach. And so sometimes we use product highlight sheets to identify investment risks. We are presently working on an initiative, another initiative which I can't talk about, but ultimately, it is about making it easier for investors to participate in certain segments without an extraordinary amount of information that they need to use, because ultimately we feel that there are salient points that an investor needs to focus on. And the challenge, of course, for us, both as regulators, for the accounting standard setters and others, is to be able to, get to that core information that people require. And so, as I said, those developments to me, I think, have just gone too far. And by the way, I wouldn't just say that for accounting standards. I would say that also applies to some of the financial regulation that has come out post the global financial crisis. So I mentioned, I sit on the board of the Financial Stability Board, and I can see that some of those slew of regulation that has appeared has been extremely complex in nature, have raised compliance costs, and therefore, we here have always taken a view that some of those, we will only adopt what is most relevant for Malaysia. And some of those reforms we have not introduced. And in fact, the SC has taken an approach. Our philosophy has been proportional regulation, in proportionate to the risks that we are trying to address. And therefore, in some cases, if we feel that we can do away, we've done that. So for instance, we now have a framework called Lodge and Launch,